Building a better Bay Area. Moving forward, finding solutions. This is ABC 7 News.
Hi there, I'm Kristen Z. You're watching Getting Answers live on ABC 7, Hulu Live, and wherever you stream. We're asking experts your questions every day at 3 to get answers for you in real time. Today, the Russian attack on Ukraine continues despite the first diplomatic talks in Belarus. Meantime, democratic nations take more action to squeeze Russia financially. Also, major news on COVID restrictions in California schools. Governor Newsom joined the governors of Oregon and Washington in setting March 11th as the final day that masks will be required in schools. This follows the CDC's move on Friday, no longer suggesting indoor masking for about 70% of Americans living in areas with low or medium COVID community level. That would include most Bay Area counties. Health and Human Services Secretary Dr. Mark Ghaly explained the change this afternoon. And joining us now to discuss this and the implications is UCSF's Director of COVID Response, Dr. Jean Noble. Dr. Noble, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's first make clear to our viewers the two main components of making masking optional instead of required. There are different dates, one for schools and one for general indoor public spaces. Walk us through that.
So kids are actually going to have the longest period of masking. They will be masked through midnight of March 11th. And it is a little bit hard to see what the reasoning is behind it, just because the unvaccinated child is still lower risk than the average vaccinated 50-year-old, say. But the end is in sight. So our kids, after 2 weeks from today, will no longer be mandated to wear masks in school. Now, that may depend yet on what our county health officers decide and what school districts themselves decide. So I'd say our kids are not totally out of the woods yet, but it is a welcome step in the right direction.
All right. And real quickly, for time, I'll just sum it up really quickly. The other component is that unvaccinated people can also go unmasked. It's optional as of tomorrow, right? So there is that. But you mentioned that, of course, local school districts and counties can still do their own thing. In fact, Dr. Ghaly emphasized that. Almost sounded like he was encouraging the locals to have their own rule. And San Francisco Unified responded saying indoor masking will continue to be in effect at SF Unified as part of our layered approach to reduce the spread of COVID-19 in our schools. Alameda County says it'll release its own revised mask mandate in the coming days. So give me your thoughts on how the locals should approach it.
Yes, I think that it is really past time to let our kids unmask. And it's really from a public health standpoint. You know, as I alluded to, vaccinated adults are at a similar, if slightly higher risk of serious outcome from COVID than the unvaccinated child. Now we're saying as of tomorrow, even the unvaccinated adult can move freely about in California without showing a vaccine, without having to wear a mask. And to put kids last in line, I think is a bit troublesome, but the end is in sight if our county health officers fall into line and follow the CDC's guidance and the California Department of Public Health guidance. So I think it's really a moment here for leadership from our county health officers to highlight that it is safe. Now is the time to let our kids get back to normal. And hopefully we will not see too many districts get in the way of that. I think San Francisco Unified's decision is disappointing. Kids have been not having a normal school environment for 2 full years, and there are downsides to that. We have already heard, however, from Oakland and Berkeley indicating that they will allow their kids to unmask as long as Alameda County health officer gives the green light. So that's where we're waiting on the edge of our seats for that.
All right. How much do you think that individual district's teachers' concerns or worries should play into that decision, right? The California Teachers Association did put out a statement urging caution, although they didn't really define it, kind of said and hinted that there should be local discussions. But do you think that should be a factor if one district's teachers are very opposed to kids not masking?
I think the reasonable answer to that question is one-way masking is a very viable option for nervous teachers. For people who are severely immunocompromised, they may indeed want to mask. They may want to up their mask game and get fitted for an N95. or teachers who are just nervous. They can certainly wear KN95s or N95s for as long as they feel comfortable. But for kids who are ready to drop their masks, I really don't think that anxiety among teachers should really get in the way.
Okay. Here's a question from our viewer that perhaps you can address. Anna Uribe says, what a mess. The unvaccinated had a free ride here. They should keep the mask for them. I think she's referring to the other part today, right? Where beginning tomorrow, it is optional for the unvaccinated not to mask. Do you have anything that you can add for her that would reassure her? Because she seems very concerned about that.
Right. I think our vaccines are highly protective. And I think our message, our public health message, got a bit muddled a year ago when we decided that vaccinated folks needed to go ahead and mask up. But really, our vaccines are an incredible success story. So you don't, as a vaccinated and boosted adult, you don't need to be worried about the threat of an unvaccinated adult to you. You are protected against serious illness and death by the power of that vaccine. And if we're ever going to move forward, I think now is the time, with Omicron really behind us in the rearview mirror.
All right. But one thing, you know, when you say if you're vaccinated, especially if you're young, you are protected against severe illness, which the science does back. And I think a lot of people are short of that. But what of the argument that you can still catch it? And as such, if you catch it, let's say your university says you have to isolate or miss your lectures for a week, and you don't want that. So it seems like what you're suggesting needs to go hand in hand with other revisions that may not be coming on the university level or school level.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that, for better or worse, our vaccines themselves are not as effective in preventing transmission in this post-Omicron phase as they were before, and say we look back with the Delta variant. So the vaccines themselves have not the great power that they did to prevent transmission. And that brings us to this endemic living. It is not possible for all of us to say we are just never going to get COVID as long as we're careful enough. That seems to be really out of our reach. And so the best that we can do is say we are going to be protected against serious outcomes from that. And a lot of us will get COVID eventually, but we no longer need to be so afraid of that. And I think that the sooner we get back to normal 2019 living, the better we will be. And for people who are nervous, to remember that for the vaccinated adult, for the vast majority of them, COVID does not represent increased risk as compared to a regular influenza season. So, you know, the risk is not zero, and that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And we no longer need to have this outsized fear of a bad outcome from COVID.
All right, quickly, I want to ask you, though, because as you know, even amongst doctors, this is somewhat controversial, as all topics have been throughout the pandemic. But, you know, today, former Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams retweeted the story about a 12-year-old boy named Caleb in Virginia who has lung challenges, asking not to sit next to maskless students. And he added that he was Caleb, that's Dr. Adams, and wished that one day his fellow citizens would care for him the way mine care for me, is what he said. That seems to be in line with others I've seen with health or immunity challenges, right? And they ask, how is it good public health to shift the burden onto the immunocompromised and vulnerable? How do you respond to that?
I would say that focused protection is really better protection for kids and adults who are really immunocompromised. It does very little to have blanket mask mandates at this stage in the game. We know that our cloth masks and even our surgical masks are probably not highly effective against Omicron, but that doesn't leave the immunocompromised without additional tools in their toolkit. Getting a fit tested N95 and really focusing our resources on that 1% or less of the population for whom the vaccine really doesn't have high efficacy will leave them more protected than in the end. Then instead of broad resources for the general population encompassing millions of healthy people, if we really focus our resources on great access to testing, to COVID treatments, and high quality masks for that small number of people who really need the best of the best, they will come out ahead in the end.
All right, Dr. Noble, please don't go away. We have a few more minutes with you after we take a short break and answering your questions on Facebook Live during the break. All right, Dr. Noble, thank you so much for your time. Simone wants to know, how does this change things or anything for childcare with unvaccinated children under the age of 5? I think the CDC did not differentiate, and for childcare settings, no more masking required or suggested. But you walk us through, what is the state saying with regard to that?
Right. We're basically agnostic to vaccination status. So we're just looking at population level statistics, hospitalization rates, hospital capacity, and saying now it is okay to go ahead and unmask because the amount of COVID out there in circulation that's causing severe illness isn't high enough to continue with broad population restrictions. So it is not in accordance to the vaccination level. It is just broadly how much COVID is out there. But something to keep in mind for worried parents is that where vaccination rates are low, natural immunity tends to be high. And we now think, particularly with Omicron, that people who have had COVID have protection from future infections and hospitalizations that is on par with those who are vaccinated. And because Omicron was so infectious, those communities with low vaccination rates, including kids, tend to have much higher levels of natural immunity because they got COVID during the last few months. So not to despair, low vaccination rates is not the end of the story. There's a lot of natural immunity out there.
All right, Dr. Noble, thank you very much. How much time before we come back out from break? Oh, we have 30 seconds. Okay, so I will not launch into a new question because we won't be able to finish that in time. All right, so we'll just ask you if you have any questions for Dr. Noble, please feel free to put them in and we'll see if we can get to any of them. We have a few more minutes when we come back on air. All right, we are back with UCSF's Dr. Jean Noble talking today, reacting to Dr. Mark Galley's announcement that the state will no longer require that kids in school wear a mask starting from, I guess, March 14th would be the first Monday that this is in effect, because March 11th, Friday, is the last day. You know, Dr. Noble, I wonder, what do you say about those who say, look, you know, today's removal of the mandate is kind of a blanket policy. It's not tied to vaccination rates, but maybe it should be tied to vaccination rates, and vaccination rates for kids are pretty low in California. Help us digest that.
Right. So one thing for parents to remember is that communities that have low vaccination rates tend to have high levels of natural immunity. And I alluded to this in the break, but Omicron has been so infectious that low vaccination communities got much higher rates of COVID infection during Omicron. And we now know that natural immunity is similar. It's on par in terms of protection from future infection and from hospitalization, on par with vaccinated immunity. So low vaccination rates often mean there is higher natural immunity out there. And that's how we're moving forward with this endemic consideration of COVID and moving beyond the pandemic phase.
All right. What about the folks who are concerned, you know, when they say, look, we do have treatments. This is true. This is cited by the CDC as well in relaxing some restrictions. But these folks say, look, they're still in short supply, or maybe they're too expensive for a lot of people, or a lot of people don't have health care or doctors. So why not make the common spaces as safe as possible, even if it means people sacrificing and making adjustments?
Right. So the first part of that is, fortunately, our supply of these very effective COVID treatments, our monoclonal antibodies, our antiviral medicine, Paxlovid, those supplies have very recently become much more robust. So I think that we are really heading in the right direction there. And then the other part is that our blanket or population-based mandates or mitigation layers have downsides to them. If they didn't have downsides, we could certainly continue them forever without looking back. But we know that masking children, for instance, kids who are English language learners, of whom we have about 1 million in our K through 12 system in California, and more than 100,000 kids with speech delay, it's really difficult to give them equal access to education with masks on. And for adults at large, we have a really vaccinated population. And then among those who never got vaccinated, a lot of them now have natural immunity. So really getting back to pre-pandemic living, I think, is a goal we can all embrace. And it really seems like if not now, then when?
All right, Dr. Jean Noble, thank you so very much for joining us today. We know you have to get back to your duties in the hospital, so we'll let you go. Take care. Coming up next, we'll talk about the crisis in Ukraine. It is developing minute by minute. We're talking live with an expert about today's peace talks with Russia and what comes next. Be right back. All right, let's see which live picture our director has in store for us today. It's a heavy day with a lot going on, and of course, we're all concerned about the developing situation in Ukraine. But here is a lovely picture of San Francisco. We'll be right back. All right, the Russia-Ukraine crisis is growing by the moment. Russian troops are attacking on multiple fronts and advancing on the capital city of Kyiv. Today, there was a round of peace talks between the two nations, but it ended without any breakthroughs as far as we know. Joining us live to discuss the latest developments happening right now is Sabrina Pinnell, political science professor at San Jose State University, specializing in post-Soviet politics. Professor Pinnell, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
So the first round of talks between Russia and Ukraine wrapped up today. Even beforehand, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said he doesn't think they will be successful. We don't have a lot of details out of them. As far as you know, what, if anything, came out of them?
Well, it's pretty obvious that the Ukrainian side didn't really expect to get much from the Russians when they went in, mainly because, of course, the attacks are still going on. And the Russians' demands were things that they couldn't readily agree to, considering the fact that it's hard to get a country to demilitarize in the middle of the fighting. And denazification is largely a ruse on the part of Vladimir Putin. The whole idea that the Ukrainian government is controlled by Nazis doesn't really make sense, given the fact that it's a multi-partisan government and actually has pro-Russia parties along with several others. So this was really an attempt, I think, to feel out whether or not Ukraine was willing to make concessions. But it's pretty clear they're willing to dig in and continue the fighting if necessary.
But just really quickly, I don't want to get bogged down on this, but I think some people are wondering, wait, but why is Russia claiming that there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine anyway? What does that stem from? What is the genesis?
The idea that there is a Nazi faction in the Ukrainian government comes from the fact that there have occasionally been right-wing parties in Ukraine. There were a couple of them in the coalition that existed in 2014. However, those parties have faded out into obscurity. Parties don't tend to last a very long time in Ukraine. And As a result, the Russian government has often tried to spin any party that is remotely pro-Europe as possibly being right-wing extremist. They also tend to focus on the idea that there is extensive anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine. There's a distinction between anti-Russian sentiment in terms of the Russian government and ethnic Russians. There's a very large ethnic Russian minority in Ukraine, and they have largely not been targeted by Ukrainians.
Okay. Look, Ukraine is surprising the world, really, with how long it's been able to hold off the Russians, hold on to its major cities. Did the Russian military underestimate the Ukrainian military, or is it the spirit of the people they underestimated, or the response of the world, or is there some dynamic that, you know, we didn't understand going in and therefore are surprised by what we're seeing?
I think Putin decided that this was going to be much like Crimea, which was that he would be able to slip in and get enough support from the local population that he could use the public to support him in taking over sections of Ukraine. But Ukraine's had 8 years of this civil war. We have the aftermath of Crimea. They are not interested in losing more territory, especially when we get closer to the western half of the country. The direct assault on Kiev was a mistake, because that was clearly meant to create concessions, but it's only encouraged people to dig in.
All right, today, President Zelensky asked for Ukraine's immediate admission into the European Union, the EU. Explain what membership would do, and explain to us why EU seems to be taking a slow approach.
Well, the interesting thing is Ukraine already has an association with the EU. This was one of the reasons why you had the invasion of Crimea in 2014. Putin was concerned that already Ukraine was getting way too close to the West. So Ukraine actually has trade privileges with the EU and a number of agreements in place. But this would get it closer to full membership, not necessarily in the Eurozone. That would have to be resolved. But this would definitely get a lot more social, political support from other EU members. This is not the same as NATO, but it would definitely help Ukraine get closer to Europe.
Is this having a surprising effect and unintended consequence of really strengthening NATO?
I think it is, to the point that even Finland and Sweden, which have traditionally been neutral and not wanted to consider joining NATO, are now considering it. Finland may be having a referendum on this soon. And as you know, Finland was trying to maintain a posture of neutrality with Russia for decades. So this is really causing some changes.
Speaking of Finland, okay, this gets into the whole airspace question that I hope you can address real quickly for us, because I think their airlines or carriers can no longer go through Russian airspace, right, along with the carriers around the world. And of course, countries around the world are banning Russian carriers, including Aeroflot, from their airspace. What does this mean and do to global travel? And why is Russian airspace so important?
So it's important to note that this is an evolving situation, because we've blocked Russian planes from European airspace. Europe has put up those barriers. Russia is now in kind refusing to accept airplanes from Europe and the US, of course. It means that planes will be diverted. They will probably have to go through Asia and other parts of the world. That will clearly make travel more difficult. But it's not just an airspace issue. They're closing down access to airports as well, which means it may be impossible to travel to certain places in the world right now. This is an evolving issue. I can't say for sure where this is going to go, but this is one of the things that clearly is hurting Russia right now.
All right. Putin has ordered Russian nuclear forces to heighten alert, right? Explain to people, what does that mean? People have these visions of, does that mean nuclear warheads are being ready? What does that mean? And I also do know that President Biden did not respond in kind, as in try to de-escalate instead of escalate that. Tell us what's happening there.
So I'm not a nuclear forces expert. What I will say is, if it's on high alert, that means that there are people in the silos, there are people that are waiting for directives, but that does not necessarily mean that they're firing up the warheads. That's not what this means. What this means is We're at a heightened sense of alert. We're watching the radar. We're watching other countries to see what they're doing. This does not mean an instant prelude to war.
All right. And what do you think President Biden's strategy is by not responding in kind, if you will?
I think the Biden administration is interpreting this as a threat, not as a promise. The idea is this is another thing on the table to shake up the people on the other side of this conflict. In this case, the U.S., which is largely in the background, but Putin is also thinking about us, not just Ukraine and not just Europe. So the response has been largely, okay, we've heard you. That does not mean we're expecting you to act this way.
All right. I mean, because some are quite afraid because he is deemed much less stable than typical world leaders. So a threat has to be taken seriously, even if it seems unwise. Okay, I want to ask you about the help that Ukraine has been getting around the world. It's really tremendous. President Biden approved nearly $400 million just in military aid. And of course, he's hoping that Congress will step up with another $6 billion for the Ukrainian people. Germany reversed its policy to never send weapons to conflict zones. So that's huge. And Canada also announced it's sending supplies and many, many more. Talk about if you think democratic nations are doing enough and pulling all the levers that they have at their disposal.
I'm not going to comment on what I think individual countries will do. I will say that in the last 5 days, we've had tremendous changes in policy. In the case of Germany, this is not just a matter of sending arms to Ukraine. They've also revising their defense policy to start increasing their military resources as well. So these are major strides, and sending weapons to Ukraine is what they consider to be a reasonable measure right now. It's notable that, again, they're not sending troops. They're not planning on having a NATO intervention in Ukraine. This is a matter of giving the Ukrainian forces, which are showing tremendous resilience, the ability to continue fighting.
All right, so much of that being attributed to their president, Volodymyr Zelensky. We'll take a short break on the air, but you're welcome to join us over on Facebook Live, where we'll continue to talk to Professor Pinnell. Be right back. And let's talk about Zelensky because, you know, how much do you think he played in terms of a role in galvanizing the nation and really strengthening their resolve? This is a man who, you know, had a multifaceted career, was an actor, comedian, dancer, did a bunch of things, and now he seems to be really stepping into his leadership role. How critical has he been?
I think the fact that he has not left the country, he's made very open rejection of the idea of leaving the country, possibly establishing a government in exile. He accepts that he is a symbol at this point. He is a symbol of people remaining in Ukraine and being willing to fight. He's also an important symbol to refute many of the claims that Putin has made. If he's claiming that there's a Nazification of the Ukrainian government, that's rather hilarious considering Zelensky is himself a Jew. So all of these various things are there to refute a lot of the claims that people and the misconceptions they have about Ukraine.
I think we have about 20 seconds, but I just want to ask you if the IOC, the Olympic Committee, calling for Russian athletes to be excluded from international competitions, do you think that will have any sort of impact?
Considering that the Olympics are over, it's a moderate response. I really can't comment on the issue of how this is going to affect the sporting world. It is an important statement given how much Russia does rely on its image, but whether or not this will affect the sporting world, I couldn't speak to that.
All right. Look, I think when this first started, few people had given Ukraine much hope. Do you think that feeling and thought has been revised at this point?
I think people are starting to feel more optimistic. I'm getting that impression from colleagues and other people I've talked to on this. The resiliency of the Ukrainians, both in terms of civilians and their military forces, have been a good surprise for some. In other cases,
Professor
people
Pinnell,
said no.
That's all the time we have. So thank you so very much for spending the time to educate us on the matter. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us on this interactive show, Getting Answers. We answered your questions about California's plan to drop the mask mandate for schools and the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We'll be here every weekday at 3 on air and on live stream answering your questions. World News Tonight is coming up next, and I'll see you at 4.